And now it's time to encounter history, or rather attempts at telling history that will make your bonds hurt for a week. Yes, it's the marvelous Simon Webber and his strange and bizarre versions of history that somehow always focus on the idea of darkies or muzzies and get the paradigm going. I suspect he could do the history of electric guitars and somehow turn it into a way to have a slap at black people. In fact, I'm sure he could with that particular one. But in any case, let's turn some sound on for this. Yep, we have it. Great. So let's go back to him. And let's see what his theory is today. Militant Islam shaped Britain by causing the English Civil War in the 17th century. Right, let's listen to this interesting view of how the English Civil War occurs.
Hello again. This is a very brief video, the purpose of which is
That's good because it
to direct viewers to an essay I have written about the causes of the English Civil War, which
a fascinating essay that represents none of the major events such as the Bishops' War or the era of personal rule, which I'll get to in a minute.
sounds a fairly dull subject, I suppose, except that the chief trigger of that conflict was a dispute about the tax known as ship money.
There is some truth in this. There was ill feeling, to say the least, about ship money, but I notice Webb doesn't tell you exactly why ship money was used by the king.
Although most of us learned about all this at school, we've mostly forgotten all about it.
You seem to have.
This is a shame because it shows just how long we have been troubled by the machinations of militant Islam and the desire of Muslims to take over the whole world. There is sometimes a tendency in this country to think that problems with Muslims trying to conquer the world and kill anybody in Europe who opposes them is something relatively new, a modern scourge.
No, anyone looking at the history of Europe would be well aware of incursions by Muslim armies and how they were pushed back. But they'd also, if they were studied a bit more deeply, would point out about how some of those Muslim armies also are fighting against other Muslim armies, and the whole situation was endlessly complicated and messy. They wouldn't make such simplistic, sweeping statements.
Well, it isn't. There have been several previous attempts by Muslims to take over Europe, and at one
To have, but what you haven't done, Simon, is establish that this was a major casus belli for the English Civil War, because it wasn't, and we'll get to that when I get to the end of you, because you're only speaking for 1 minute and 40 seconds.
time, Muslim armies invaded France and reached Austria.
So they did, Simon, but those are separate issues to the English Civil War.
The English Civil War was precipitated by this kind of jihad, although hardly anybody in Britain is aware of it now.
What, no one's aware of the raiding of the Ottoman slave traders? You think that there's a nation of 60 to 70 million people who are that stupid that we're unaware of the Ottoman slave trade?
In the description to this video, I give a link to a piece I put up on my Substack account.
And what a piece it is.
You've only got to click on it. It's free to read. And
yes, it's free to read. Notice that, and I've read it. And Simon has claimed previously that I pay to read his Substack. Notice he said that at the end, it's free to read, and I have read it. So, Simon, don't be doing any of your old bullshit saying that I pay to read that, because you've now shown I haven't. But in any case, one of the reasons for the Civil War was the personal rule. And that was basically Charles didn't call a parliament for around 11 years. During the period of his so-called personal rule, 1629 to 1640, known by his enemies as the 11-year tyranny because he had dissolved parliament and ruled by decree, Charles had to resort to dubious fiscal expedients because he couldn't raise finances any other ways, most notably ship money. And that's why he tried to raise it, because he had no other sodding way of paying his bills. And he used the excuse of massive raids. Yes, there were some. Simon, I'll grant Simon that. But Charles had no other way to raise money because he'd basically pissed everybody off. So he used this, an annual levy for the reform of the navy that in 1635 was extended from English ports to inland towns. This inclusion of inland towns was construed as a new tax without parliamentary authorization, not surprisingly, since the original version of ship money was supposed to be paid by coastal towns who could be attacked by ships, whereas towns inland, well, they weren't very likely to be attacked by ships unless it was a full-scale invasion. When combined with ecclesiastical reforms undertaken by Charles' close advisor, William Law, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and with a conspicuous role assumed in these reforms by Henrietta Maria, Charles' Catholic Queen, and remember the era we're in, and remember we're post-Reformation here, and how popular a Catholic Queen would be in Britain, and her courtiers in England, many in England became alarmed. Nonetheless, despite grumblings, there is little doubt that had Charles managed to rule his other ministers who controlled England, his peaceful reign might have been extended indefinitely. But here's the kicker: Scotland and England proved his undoing. In 1633, Thomas Wentworth became Lord Deputy of Ireland and set out to govern that country without regard for any interest but that of the Crown. His thorough policies aimed to make Ireland financially self-sufficient, to enforce religious conformity with the Church of England as defined by Laud, Wentworth's close friend and ally, to civilise the Irish. Well, we never managed that. I'm not civilised in the slightest. And to extend royal control throughout Ireland by establishing British plantations and challenging Irish titles to land. Wentworth's actions, as you can imagine, alienated both the Protestant and the Catholic ruling elites in Ireland, some of them which were tied together in ways that he probably didn't understand. In much the same way, Charles' willingness to tamper with Scottish land titles unnerved landowners there. However, it was Charles' attempt in 1637 to introduce a modified version of the English Book of Common Prayer that revoked a right for rights in Scotland. And despite its moderate tone and conservative format, the National Covenant was a radical manifesto against the personal rule of Charles I, justified revolt against the interfering sovereign. And you therefore had the Bishops' Wars, the return of Parliament, and so on. None of this has been mentioned by Simon. These are all major drivers and major events that drove the country to civil war eventually. Instead, Simon has tried to create a half-baked fucking theory to carry on his demonizing of Muslims all the time. No one's going to pretend the Ottoman slave raids were a bundle of laughs so that you'd have been want to be one of the people picked up by them. But Simon has tried to pick out one issue that had maybe a minor impact and was exaggerated for the sake of allowing the king to raise funds because he couldn't raise them any other way, and has tried to turn it into yet another of his let's find anything I can beat the shit out of Muslims with games.